Thank you for joining us in this beautiful Sunday morning. Thank you, Bob, for acknowledging the beginning of this blessed Holy Week, this being the day that we celebrate the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. I was most impressed they actually take your glasses off to read the fine print on your phone, whereas I definitely have to do the opposite. So, again, today is Palm Sunday. The sermon has nothing to do with Palm Sunday. We'll make up for that next week, where we'll focus solely on Easter and that celebration. We have, obviously, 2 services for that. So please join us if you are able to, as well as the breakfast right in between, as mentioned by Michael already. I do have one last announcement. We will have a wedding here on Thursday morning. Michael and Leanne's wedding, and you are all invited if you are able to get off of work and whatnot. School starts at 11, and then there is a reception right after the wedding ceremony. I will ask for some help. We want to organize the church after service, rearrange the tables both here and then the fellowship hall. So if you are able to stick around for that, Michael Salazar will be organizing that effort. So thank you ahead of time. Now, without further ado, please turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 11. And we have slotted for our study today verses 11 to 24. And I'll give you a few moments to find your way there. In Romans chapter 11, verses 11 to 24. And here it is a repetition of something that I've already mentioned and we've already seen. Paul very often, he envisions certain questions. He anticipates certain misconceptions. So this segment of Romans, his letter to the Roman church, is very much that. And what we've seen before is Paul focusing on particular people groups, if you will. He actually started his letter to the Romans by addressing all of humanity. Do you remember what he said about all of humanity as far as their culpability? Everybody's kind of under this umbrella. Everybody is in this fallen state. But then, thereafter, and pretty recently, he's focused on the Jews and their status, their state, their condition due to their lack of faith. And we talked about the fact that even though it looks pretty dark and it looks pretty grim, their state, God has always historically in that era and up until this era always saved a faithful remnant. But now Paul is going to shift gears and he is focusing on the Gentiles, the Gentile portion of the Roman church, because he envisions, he foresees, he thinks that they will somehow have this misconceived notion regarding God's plans for the Jewish nation in its entirety. Not only this faithful remnant that we've been talking about, but the whole and the entire Jewish nation. Paul will explain here that they have not been cut off completely and have not been rejected totally by God. So that's more or less what we have in store. So let me get my spectacles here and let me read verse 11 to 24, and you can follow along, and then we'll go back and take a look at it one portion at a time. So starting from verse 11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, but through their fall to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now if their fall is riches, for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you, Gentiles, and as much as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke jealousy to those who are my flesh, and save some of them. For if their being cast away is their reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Verse 16. For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say, then branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said, because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore, consider the goodness and the severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you, goodness. If you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Amen. So again, Paul is addressing specifically the Jews, and one thing that we need to do right off the bat, taking a closer look at verses 11 and 12, are certain words that are being utilized here pertaining to this action of falling. Now, depending on your version of the Bible, depending on which edition of a particular version of the Bible, you will most certainly have different words utilized here. But in my version, this the New King James Version. I had a senior moment here. In the New King James Version, let me read this for you again. It says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, but through their fall. So now we have three words here. In this Bible that I just read, two of them are fall, one of them is stumble. But actually in the original, there are three different words that roughly, generally mean stumbling or falling. Now, Paul is utilizing these words differently. They have an inherent different meaning, but here, specifically based on context, Paul is utilizing these three different words in different ways, even though in general, all three of them mean falling. The first term, which here in my Bible is translated as stumble, it just basically means stumbling. It's not a complete falling flat upon your face. Have you ever done that? Have you ever seen somebody done that? Now it's very common for us to see people falling on their face. Why? Because they walk around with this little device, this gadget, right? And they can't look away because it is so important. It actually is, it's even more important than their life, because oftentimes people even get ran over because they are so concerned with this little gadget, and then they fall and break their necks or whatever. Well, this first word is not this complete and utter falling. It is a stumbling. You kind of caught yourself. In the middle of the fall, you were able to just kind of secure your balance so that you wouldn't just eat it. Now, the second fall here, where it states, I say then, have they stumbled, but that they should fall? This fall now is a complete fall.
This is where the person just eats it. And then we have a third one. Certainly not, but through their fall. This fall, this third word is actually similar to the first word, but it is a different term. It just means sort of a misstep. Have you ever been walking around and then you're out in public and then you kind of trip, but you just catch yourself and you look around and you just hope nobody saw you? That's kind of the gist of this word. It's a misstep. It's a false step. You look around and you hope nobody saw you. So 3 different words that have generally the same meaning, but Paul is using them in a very particular and different way. So the first term is basically saying, look, something happened here. Israel, the Jews, they have in fact stumbled. But did they completely fall? Did they completely fall off of or out of God's grace? Is their state of disbelief or unbelief, does that lead to God completely and utterly and totally rejecting them? That's the question. Paul goes on to say, certainly not. They definitely stumbled, but they did not completely fall away. And then he continues, but through their fall, which again is a misstep, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Because they misstepped, because they stumbled, even though they did not completely and utterly fall, God utilized this for the benefit of the Gentiles. So a good example of this, or illustration, and I've mentioned this before, I used to run track in high school. Every time I talk about my athletic prowess, I feel like, remember that TV show in the 90s and early 2000s with Al Bundy? And he had a athletic history of being a famous football player in Polk High, and every time he talked about his rich athletic history, people kind of addressed him in a different way. So here I'm being the same way. So I ran track, and I ran specifically hurdles, and I experienced all of these types of fall, all of them. And I actually, within one race, I experienced all 3 of them. So when you run track without hurdles, you shouldn't fall. So if you're falling, just running a straight line, then there's something wrong with you. But with hurdles, there's an added disadvantage that you're actually, hopping over, jumping over obstacles, right? So it just makes it even tougher for you to run fast. And very often, as you are jumping over the hurdle, you will nick the top of it. And it kind of just throws you off a little bit. But most of the time that happens, that occurs, you can kind of, gain back your balance and continue to run. So that happens very often. But every once in a while, you mistime your jump. You don't lift your leg as high. Maybe you're looking around too much and you're not concentrating on what is before you, what is right in front of you, and you hit the hurdle and you fall. You can get away with stumbling. You can get away with a misstep. But if you fall, your race is over. All you will see is dust. You will hear, and then you're there on the ground looking like a jerk, having to continue the race, but the race is technically over. You lost. There is no way for you to finish in a victorious manner because you are literally in last place. Paul is saying
that, yeah, the Jews have faltered. No doubt about it. They have nicked the top of that hurdle. They've stumbled, and it was kind of awkward, but they did not fall flat on their face. The race is still on. So he continues on verse 12. Now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So Paul's argument here is that God utilized this faltering, this stumbling of the Jews for the benefit of the world, namely the rest of the world, the Gentiles. But then he goes on with this line of reasoning by saying, look, you were benefited by this. How much more will the world benefit if they actually fulfill God's original intent for them? Because God's original intent for the Jews, according to the covenant that he made through Abraham, was that they should be a blessing unto the world. They have stumbled. They have misstepped. You were blessed. How much more of a blessing will we experience if they actually are able to miraculously finish this race? And then he continues, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh, and save some of them. So Paul alluded to this idea of jealousy multiple times, and here he is incorporating this into his own plans, right? He mentioned that this was already part of God's plans, but then now he acknowledges, I even do this. I am an apostle to the Gentiles. But in the back of my mind, every time I go to the Gentiles, my hope, what I really want to achieve is to cause them to be jealous of you. And every one of us, regardless of the type of relationship that we think of, have very likely been in a situation where, because you were privileged by something or someone, after a while, that privilege actually stimulated in you a sense of indifference. You took that person, you took that relationship for granted. That might be a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a spouse, a parent, a child, a job, whatever that relationship might be. And we can add a bunch of other relationships to that list. Because in the passing of time, those benefits, those blessings, those privileges, you just kind of got used to them. And again, that initial appreciation, very often, it turns into this indifferent behavior, negligence, if you will. So this is what Paul is envisioning, pertaining to his brethren, pertaining to the Jews. They were privileged, without a doubt. They were the ones that God chose to be this holy nation, separated for his purposes unto the world. But instead of acknowledging this privilege and continuing to fulfill God's plans unto the world, they kind of thought that they were so special, so different, that salvation, that acceptance, that this relationship that was special between them and God, it was all about their efforts. It was all about their merit. It was all about what they had done. And because of that, then God was the one who was even blessed. Because of all of the awesome things that they had accomplished and what they meant to God.
And due to that state of mind, over a few hundred years, they fell into this state of indifference. But then Paul is saying, look, this is true about the Jews, much like it is true about humanity in general. And when this happened, there's a trick that human beings do onto another. And I'm sure, again, you've been in this situation where you were indifferent about something or someone, and then that something or someone now was focused upon a third party. And then you think back about those glory days, the good times. And you were indifferent before, but now this feeling is bubbling up inside of you. What is that feeling called? It's called jealousy. You didn't care about that individual, that entity, that relationship much before. Again, it was kind of stagnant. You were indifferent. You were negligent. But now that you see that that party now is gazing upon another, oh man, that drives you crazy. That stirs up emotions in you that you did not even know were there. And Paul is saying, look, I am the apostle to the Gentiles. And in Acts, we see it over and over again when the ministry of Paul is being described. Over and over, it is stated that he would go to the Gentiles after the Jews had rejected the gospel message that he was trying to bring to them. And he literally said, look, because you have rejected this message, now I go to the Gentiles. But here he is basically explaining his reasoning, his plan, what was in the back of his mind. In accordance to God's own purposes, he hoped to make them jealous. And then he goes on. So now Paul has already established this base for his argument. Essentially, he's saying, look, we've been talking about the remnant, this faithful remnant that God has separated, that God has kept pure. So the remnant is a minority. But just because God is working through a minority historically until this day, it doesn't mean that he has totally, completely rejected the majority. The ethnic nation of Israel. God still has a purpose and God still has a plan. Now, how exactly does that work? He goes on to give us a couple of analogies. On verse 15 to verse 22, we have one very brief analogy and then another analogy that is a little bit more in depth. And he goes on to talk about it in greater detail, giving us greater information. So let me read all that section and then we'll go back and take a look at it. From verse 15 to verse 21. For if their being cast away is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life to the dead? For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree were grafted among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I may be grafted. And well said, because of unbelief they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. The first analogy is the analogy of this consecrated doe. Not doe, a deer. A a cake of sorts made out of grain. So in Numbers chapter 15, there was a portion of the law that talked about first fruits. And first fruits can either be literal fruits or anything that you harvest that is the best and the initial portion, which usually was the best. So in that part of Numbers chapter 15, the Jews were instructed to harvest the grain, make dough, and consequently a cake out of that dough, and a part of that was to be given to God. It was to be almost sacrificed to God. It was to be consecrated to God. That was God's part. Consequently, that was holy. That was separated. And Paul's argument here is, well, you got all of this dough, right? You mix the oil, you mix the water, you were there, pounding away, and now we have all of this dough in front of you. You cut out a portion of it, made this little cake, and you offered it to God. Consequently, it is holy. It is separated for God's purposes. Now, what do you make of the remaining part of that dough? Is it not just as holy? It came out of the same lump. It came out of the same harvest. You worked on it in the same way. Just because one portion was specifically separated for God, it doesn't mean that the remaining portion is any different. It is just as holy. And here the analogy is clear. He is talking about the nation, the ethnic nation of Israel as a whole, in comparison to this remnant, this minority that God was utilizing for his particular and specific purposes throughout history. But he's saying, in a way, everything belongs to God. Everything is holy. Everything was separated for God's purposes, even though this minority now is fulfilling a particular godly objective. So that's the first analogy. That's the first illustration. And it's very straightforward, very simple. But then he goes on to give us another illustration, which he works on a little bit more, and it's the illustration of the olive tree. Now, in the illustration of the olive tree, there are certain assumptions that we must make because there are many variables, right? And these are up for debate. Depending on which commentary or your own personal reading, you may qualify these variables in different ways. And I did my best to try to name and explain these variables within context, not using my previous knowledge or my theological beliefs, but just really truly just focusing on the text at hand to figure out Paul's intentions with all of these variables. But again, the olive tree is the illustration, but the olive tree, it has different parts to them. And now we need to define our variables. Defining variables, it's important. So there's an assumption here pertaining to the Jews and the Gentiles that these are distinct populations. There are the Jews, and then there's the rest of the world. And these are two different people groups. That's the assumption. I know we can make arguments where these two kind of meet, right? If somehow, one marries another, or if one becomes part of a Baptist church, how do you define that third Paul is not taking that into consideration. Paul is looking at these two groups as distinct people groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, specifically the saved Gentiles. And also there's an assumption that because there's somewhat of a manipulation with this olive tree that somebody's doing this, and this somebody is God. Even though he is not being named here, there's an assumption in general that God is the one that is in control. Consequently, God is the farmer that is manipulating this olive tree. Now, continuing in our efforts to name our variables here, to define our variables, there is something here that leads us to believe that there are two types of olive trees that the farmer is working on. There is a cultivated olive tree, and then there is a wild olive tree. Now, what's the difference between the cultivated olive tree and the wild olive tree? The cultivated olive tree is the name brand olive tree. It's the type of olive tree that actually bears fruit. It's the type of olive tree that you pay money for because, it's part of this lineage of great olive trees, so you know where it came from, and if you just take care of it in an appropriate manner, it will bear fruit, or else you can return it 2 years later to Home Depot, regardless if it dies, because they will give your money back because they are so sure that this olive tree can be planted and harvested that they will back it with a lifetime guarantee. The other type of olive tree is the type of stuff that we're going to cut out and trim in a couple of days or a couple of weeks when we do the church cleanup. It's this type of stuff that grows naturally, right? Almost like weeds. Where did this olive tree? I have no idea where it came from. It's just here, right? It's technically an olive tree, but it doesn't bear fruit. Why? The root is weak. It's not name brand. If you were to cut out or dig up this olive tree and try to take it back to Home Depot or any other, gardening place where you buy plants, they would laugh at you because they would tell you, no way this was purchased here. That is a wild tree. That is a purposeless tree. That tree is not valuable at all because it just kind of grows like weeds. Get out of here. You will not get a refund. So now God is working with these two trees. So this cultivated olive tree, if we are defining our variables, it's Israel. It's all over the Bible. It's one of the symbolisms that are mostly used for the nation of Israel in general. It's not wild because God had a purpose for them. It is name brand. God is the one that kind of cared for this tree for a purpose. It was supposed to bear fruit. And then this other type of olive tree, still an olive tree, but doesn't bear fruit. It's just wild. It's just all over the place. These are the Gentiles. The root is not strong enough to bear fruit. But something happened. What happened? In this cultivated olive tree, the farmer, God, noticed that it was not bearing fruit, even though he is the one that planted that. He established the perfect environment. He cultivated that. He watered it. He put the appropriate type of soil. He cared for it. Yet, it was not bearing fruit. So what did he do with the branches that were not bearing fruit? He cut them off. He cut them away because they were useless for his purposes. That and those were the Jews that were not part of this faithful remnant that God had kept for a purpose throughout history. It was the ethnic Jews that rejected the gospel, that rejected God, that went about business their own way, that focused so much on the law and neglected the God of the law because they felt that they deserved everything if they fulfilled certain parameters that were established by the law. But again, forgetting completely about the God of the law.
So God breaks them off and breaks them away. But then you have this name brand olive tree with branches broken off. God's not going to have anything, with his name on it looking so shabby. He wants this olive branch or cultivated olive tree to be fruitful. He wants it to grow. He wants it to be successful. So he looks around, and being a great farmer, he knows all of these techniques. And there is, lo and behold, this technique called grafting. What is this technique called grafting? Well, you can actually get a tree, and you can essentially take a part of another tree and almost glue it into this tree. It's grafting. And you can do it in different types of, fruits and types of trees here. They're both olive trees, but one wild and the other one cultivated. So God, he goes to these wild olive trees, the Gentiles, and he takes their branches, which by themselves bear no fruit because their root is weak. He takes the branches and he grafts them into the cultivated olive tree. And now these previously wild branches, who are now part of this cultivated olive tree that are bearing fruit, they look around and they look on the ground and they see all of these broken off previously these branches that were previously part of this cultivated tree, and they're like, look at those guys. What losers. Look at them. We took their place. We were there just hanging out, being wild olive trees, and God thought that we were worth more than we were, so he got us and he just stuck us in there and he broke them off, and now they're all over the ground and doing nothing. Paul is envisioning this problem. He is envisioning the Gentiles thinking too much of themselves and even thinking that God has completely forgotten about the Jews. Completely forgotten about his promises. We have another variable that we have not mentioned here, that I have not defined, the root. So based on the illustration, Paul says here that the root supports the branches and not the other way around. And he's talking to the Gentiles. So if the root supports the branches, then the branches cannot be the same thing as the roots, right? Leads us to believe that that is, somewhat of a logical conclusion. Most likely, the root that is being mentioned within this illustration are God's plans to redeem the world through this covenant that he made originally to Abraham. So oftentimes when we think of the Abrahamic covenant, we tend to focus solely on the Jews. But it's actually an overall umbrella idea that encompasses so much more than the Jewish nation. Because again, within that covenant, God was going to select this nation, but the purpose was for them to influence the entire world. So every other scheme that we see in the Bible, any other covenant, any other agreement that we see God making with human beings, it sort of falls under and within this bigger covenant that we see originally made through Abraham. So it is likely, even though it's debatable, and there are different arguments to be made, and you can define it possibly in different ways. Based on this immediate context, what Paul is alluding to is this original covenant that God made through Abraham. It's not just the Jews, it's God's intentions to redeem the world through the Jews, essentially. And he's saying, look, you are no bigger, you are no better than the root. The root supports you and not the other way around. So then, if that is true, then you need to be careful. Why do you need to be careful?
You need to be careful that you do not boast, that you do not brag, that you don't look around with these branches that were broken off. They're all over the ground, and say, I am so much better. Look at me. Look at how far we've come. Look at who we are. You are no better. You are no better than them. If you think that you are in that status because of merit, then you are no better than them. The only thing that keeps you glued into this cultivated olive tree is grace through faith. That's it. When you actually do grafting, there's something called grafting tape. It's this little green, almost translucent tape. Who has ever grafted a tree here before or seen that happen? You guys are horrible for the purposes of my illustration. Should have given homework. So there's this little translucent green tape that when you do graft, so you chisel away a part of the bark, and then you cut off a branch or a portion of another tree, and then you stick it in, but it's just gonna fall down, right? If you don't sort of attach it with something. So then you grab this piece of tape, and then you just wrap it around so that secures it until that bond is made permanent. That grafting tape is essentially grace through faith. Paul is saying, if you use anything else, if you think merit is what is keeping you within this new tree, this olive tree, this cultivated olive tree, guess what's going to happen? You're going to fall away. You're going to be broken off because there's nothing else that can keep you attached. So when Paul says, and he states here on verse 22, actually on verse 21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. He's not talking about individual believers here. Again, Paul is categorizing people groups, and he's saying the Jews in general and the Gentiles in general. You Gentiles have been privileged. You're saved by grace through faith. Now, if you think that this privilege now is earned, is merit-based, you will end up just like they ended up. That will be your fate. So now moving forward, Paul is going to conclude this portion by talking about the difference between possibilities, likelihoods, and probabilities pertaining to the Jewish people group and the Gentile people group. So on verse 22 all the way to verse 24, let me read that. He says, therefore, again, a concluding remark, therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. Consider both. Don't just consider the severity, consider the goodness as well. Don't just consider the goodness, consider the severity as well. It's a package deal. How? On those who fell, severity. But towards you, goodness. If you continue in his goodness, otherwise you will be cut off. If you continue in his graces, in his grace, through faith, you're good. If you think that you are attached because of your own merit, you're cut off. But again, in general, not talking about individuals, but in general as a people group. But then he goes on to say on verse 23, and they also, if, this if is important, if then statements, it denotes consequences, right? So if they do not continue in unbelief, so it's a negative, a double negative. If they do not continue in their unbelief, other way to put it, if they believe, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? The premise of Paul's argument is this. If we're talking about likelihood, if we're talking about probabilities, it was unlikely, it was technically harder for God to graft you wild olive tree branches into this cultivated olive tree. God did it because he's God. But if we're just in general talking about likelihood, what is hardest to do, that would have been the hard thing to do. For God, if they believe, there's the if. So there's no salvation apart from grace and faith. But if they believe, how much easier will it be for God to graft in the original branches? So much easier. There's such a higher probability of success in that endeavor in comparison to what God did to you. It's easy for God to do that. And now as we move forward to, or towards our conclusion, we just think about world history. Let's think about world history, shall we? In the history of the world, many nations and many kingdoms have risen and fallen. Superpowers, mid-sized kingdoms and nations, anything in between. Risen and fallen, risen and fallen. Sometimes it takes decades, sometimes it takes centuries, but all follow that same pattern. But there's one oddball. There is a nation, there is a kingdom, there is a people group that were once a mighty group above all other nations and all other kingdoms, and it fell just like any other kingdom or nation in the history of the world. But guess what? Miraculously, fast forward thousands of years, it remains. Here it is. Has never happened in the history of history. None. No other nation, no other kingdom, no other people group has resurrected such as the nation of Israel. And we here have them thousands of years later. Insignificant. No natural resources there in the desert. Still here. Look at what Paul says, and we're not going to deal with this verse in particular, but I want to just focus on kind of, the language that he uses on the following verse, verse 25. For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant. Depending on your translation, this could be translated as, don't be dumb. Don't be dumb. There's something called replacement theology. And basically what that means is an idea that the Gentiles, the Gentile church, but Gentiles in particular, that they have somehow totally replaced Israel pertaining to God's purposes and promises. So everything that applied to the Jews in the Old Testament now it applies to the Gentiles, the Gentilic church from now on, and God has totally rejected them. And now we just kind of got the baton, and everything is applicable to us, and nothing more is applicable to them. Paul is saying, don't be dumb. There's a reason why they're here till this day.
if God had completely and totally rejected them, they would not have survived. We don't know when, we don't even know how, but God has a purpose for them. Don't be dumb. But ending on this note now, pertaining to how this applies to us in more practical ways. So, when we look upon society, whether we're focusing on the Jews or just people in general, human beings, right? We look at the ailments that afflict society, and naturally, if you are a believer, you disagree with them. Isn't that true? Isn't that correct? You are in total disagreement with that today. Be careful. That which you disagree with today can easily be replicated by you tomorrow. It is not because of you. Do you know why you're saved? Do you know why you're saved? Do I know why I'm saved? It literally took a miracle. That's the only reason why we are saved. By a miracle of God. Be careful. That which we look upon, the ailments of the world, if not for a miracle from above, we would be practicing that right now, today. And in the future, if we don't watch out, we may succumb to the same temptations that now they struggle with. Amen.